Attendees are in listen-only mode.
I'm founder and CEO of Oxford Computer Group, and I'm going to talk to you today about integrating AD and Azure AD with the subheading, is it really possible to have everything, a great user experience and security and governance and everything else? More specifically, this is what I intend to cover. This is, first of all, something of a personal view. So there'll be gaps. There are things that I'm particularly interested in and things that I probably should have said and so on. And I may go into a little bit too much detail with some things and not enough with others, and I can only apologize for that. So first of all, I want to talk about the IT challenge of meeting operational business requirements, staying secure, satisfying governance frameworks, and meeting user expectations all at the same time. And I'm going to go into a little bit about how the on-premises identity access and security picture has evolved over the time that we've been doing it, what the advent of cloud identity access and security has meant, and also connecting the two together. And that really is the important part of this, is how we synchronize those, how we get AD and Azure AD working together and the advantages of that and so on. And finally, I want to bring in approaches to governance. This is a little bit more difficult to do because it's such a big topic. But what I'll do is talk about some of the features that we expect to be brought by a governance solution and some of the architectures that we're finding to be successful at a pretty high level. So let's talk first of all about how user expectations have evolved. There was a time when users had an AD account. In enterprises, they might have had lots of accounts in separate systems, and they were having to log in with potentially different usernames, different passwords, and often calling help desk to reset passwords. So once a month, you go into a system to enter your time, you forget your password by the next month, and you ask for it to be set again, and so on. Now, users expect the same username and password in all of these systems, and preferably some kind of single sign-on, same sign-on type of thing. We'll be talking more about that. And of course, self-service password reset. Again, a little while ago, not so long ago, the way you accessed work systems from home, first of all, it was something of a luxury, not for everybody, and using typically a VPN solution. Today, work systems are expected to be accessible from anywhere and preferably on any device. And all of this has to be seen against a backdrop of increased security risk and growing regulatory requirements. So let's talk about how security the security requirements have evolved. Not so long ago, credentials and permissions were controlled at the application level, many of them being completely incompatible with each other. This meant a lot of additional admin work to give people the access they needed, tended to lead to people having more access permissions than they really needed, credentials being left in place after people had left the company, and so on. Modern authentication and authorization mechanisms are designed to be interoperable and to simplify management. So if we're thinking about Azure AD, we're expecting that lots of applications are all sharing the same authentication mechanism and possibly authorization mechanism. If we think about the kind of solutions available to deal with this, we could bring a synchronization solution to integrate these disparate systems and alleviate that admin headache. And I'll be talking about that shortly. On premises and in the past, that typically involved quite a lot of effort. Cloud systems are integrated by design, of course. I'll be referring to both of these shortly. Overall security was, certainly still is if it's just on premise, provided primarily by some kind of a perimeter. The corporate network is protected, and each organization, of course, is responsible for managing all of those threats. If we think about how things are working now in the cloud, overall security, it tends to be based on identity. There's no concept of inside and outside, and it's now the vendor that's taking responsibility for identifying bad sites, compromised credentials, making sure that everything's patched properly, taking care of the software and indeed, of course, the hardware. By the way, if you have questions, do feel free to type them in. I may not be able to focus on that at the same time as presenting. Certainly, I'll pick them up at the end. There's also an evolving risk environment. So ubiquitous internet connectivity has made attacks more common. We all know that. And not only are they more common, but they're evolving more quickly. And that makes it very hard for internal IT departments to keep up. It's simply hard work staying secure. And of course, high profile security failures, which we all read about and know about, and some of you may have been involved with, have led to increased regulatory controls. And that simply places additional stress and additional requirements on the internal IT departments. And there's certainly been discussion about whether the cloud is a secure place for keeping our data, our identity data. And in particular, I can remember people saying, oh, we'll never put HR data in the cloud. But I think what's happened over the last few years is people have realized that it was never perfect before, that the IT department perhaps had left something to be desired in terms of their absolute security, and that Microsoft, which is our example here, totally focused on securing their cloud, can probably do a better job. The thing is that while the cloud we might feel that the cloud is being well looked after, we still have stuff on premises. So hold that thought, because we're obviously going to be talking about how we marry these two together. I want to just talk about the on-premises story, not for long, because I guess many of you will be familiar with this. But if we look back, we've got a decade-and-a-half story of one product. Of course, I'm dealing with Microsoft, so one product with many names that's been doing a great job on premises, and it still is. Many organizations still using it, even developing it, even still putting it in now, and have built their processes around it and have come to rely on it. And it is perhaps the most renamed product we can think of. We might add a codicil to this story, but this would be getting ahead of ourselves, because I'm going to come to that shortly. Just to be clear about what MIM, Microsoft Identity Manager, in its various guises has been doing, by synchronizing systems, in particular by pulling user data from HR-like systems and provisioning other systems, we've been able to have a single identity to manage, huge administrative benefit. As far as users are concerned, they can get the same sign-on. We assume that their accounts names are being synchronized, but we can also synchronize passwords. From a security perspective, we're getting consistent data. So when we look in a particular system and we say, should we give this person access, we can look at their attributes, we can see what their job title is, what their department is, and make a decision based on it. And from a governance perspective, it's at least an advantage to know what you know about users, to know that it's being consistently applied across these systems. Now, we can add into that, in terms of the evolution of this, that if you also include the MIM portal, then you're bringing the user into the picture more. You are allowing for proper formal group management, query-based and approval-based, and workflows, so that we can handle the join, move, leave situations more formally. From a user perspective, they get self-service password reset, group management, and indeed can manage some of their own attributes and perhaps see other people's attributes. So we get a white pages kind of thing going on. And from a security perspective, we've now got formal group management. And from a governance perspective, we have some confidence about the way that people are getting access to systems, that it is formalized. And just for the sake of completeness, let's mention Behold. And I'm certainly not, don't want to be an advert for Behold, but Behold brought role-based access control. So this allows you to further manipulate the data that's being synchronized, to pull all the permissions out of all of these systems, associate them with enterprise roles, and get a more formal management and a simplification once it's in place. And that's a big deal once it's in place. But once it's in place, to allow you a simpler administration of permissions across systems. The user gets perhaps to request roles. From a security perspective, well, clearly, if we are more formally managing permissions, we will feel that's a better basis for security. And of course, a lot of this is about governance. So the ability to demonstrate formal access controls through role-based access control and attestation of roles and permissions. Now, many organizations won't have got that far, and let's deal with that a little later. We'll talk about governance properly later. But I will say that it would be perfectly possible to cross out behold there and plug in something else. And I think the governance system de jure is Saviynt. And Saviynt is not being very fair to Saviynt here, because it is far more than a replacement for that. And anyway, again, we're getting ahead of ourselves because I'm going to talk about this. Perfectly possible to extend MIM to the cloud, and that's something that we've done and other people have done many times, but there's no need to do that. It's probably now not the right way to go and not the way that we would recommend, and I'll come to that, as I say. So then along comes Azure AD. Azure then is Microsoft's cloud offering, and we want all its cloudy benefits. So first of all, flexible capacity. We don't want to be restricted to the particular servers that we've either bought and paid for or are leasing or whatever. We want to know that we can expand as we need to. Known costs, so probably per user licensing costs, which we know. High availability, so Microsoft in this case taking care that our data is available in a number of different centers, whatever happens, almost. Mobility, of course, it's a cloud solution, so access from wherever. Ease of administration, this is all about centralization of everything, bringing everything to one place where we can administer it rather than having it distributed all over the place in different systems. And Azure AD, Azure Active Directory then, is the directory that's used by Azure and Office 365, and it's where users and their access are managed and where all the security and governance happens, and so that's really what we're interested in here. And it's designed from the outset to give the administrative control and the user experience that otherwise you would have to have a very highly developed on-premises implementation, which can be done with something like MIM, but this is something that's pretty much available out of the box, designed from the outset. And very importantly, security through comprehensive protection of identity. So Microsoft are able to access multiple signals about devices, location, user behavior, and so on. We'll talk about this more later. Lists of compromised credentials that they go and access, and to use those to make decisions about whether this is a safe login, whether credentials have been compromised, and so on. And even to allow for real-time remediation, so install a fix, step up to multi-factor authentication, step up to some secondary authentication mechanism, or even block access. And governance controls built in. So governance is a big story in Azure AD at the moment, and with just-in-time admin access, access reviews of various kind, which is really attestation by any other name. As far as Azure AD itself is concerned, it's a great governance story. It doesn't extend much outside of Azure AD, and that's something that I'll address in a little while. So it is meeting these expectations, and we are the expectations that we set at the beginning. We are able to get single sign-on in various forms from anywhere on any device, as appropriate. Obviously, you may not want your users getting access from anywhere on any device, and integrated identity and security and step-up security. So the Azure Security Center is offering a whole raft of possibilities. So we've got integrated threat intelligence. So this is looking for bad actors by leveraging all manner of data. The Microsoft Digital Crimes Unit is a huge investment and growing, and the Microsoft Security Response Center as well. External feeds for all sorts of data, looking at user behavior, known patterns to discover malicious behavior and so on, and generally detecting anomalies. Building a historical baseline to look at things which are just deviating from what's normal. And I will not attempt to demo this or these things or to go into any detail on them, partly because originally I was going to do this presentation a month or so ago, and a lot's happened since then, particularly with the Ignite conference, there have been a huge number of announcements. So this is a moving target, it always is. And I'd recommend you go to YouTube and check out anything that interests you from the Ignite conference if you want to know the latest on all of these things. Integrated applications, of course, a huge number of applications available in the gallery or your own applications. Various authentication mechanisms that allow this to take place so that we get our single sign-on, and even authorization in some cases. So an example would be Salesforce, where it's possible to, based on a group in Azure AD, be given a role in Salesforce, for example. Integrated administration and reporting, so this is all about the centralization again, bringing everything together, bringing all the data together in one place to go and look. And there we can also integrate that with your own SIEM system, so we can integrate your own logs with the Azure Security Center and make everything available through a centralized place. Also, I've already mentioned role-based management of Azure AD and Azure resources. So this is defining roles which allow people to do the tasks they need and no more, again, as applied to Azure AD itself. So to be a little bit more specific about some of these important features, if a user is trying to get access to, we'll say, their My Apps portal to get access to the applications they want in the cloud, they're first of all going to hit identity protection, which is going to be taking data from many, many sources. And based on behavioral analytics, data from all sorts of sources, all sorts of signals they can take account of, they may be allowed in, or it may be that we need to block their access or get them to reset their password before they're allowed in. And once they decide that they're going to use one of these applications, it may be necessary there may be a conditional access policy defined, again, based on all kinds of signals that are available, make a decision as to whether that access should be granted or whether it should be blocked, or perhaps there should be another level of authentication. And conditional access, by the way, is evolving. Microsoft listened to customer requirements and they react quickly, in fact, very impressively. And now we're seeing custom controls, third-party integration into conditional access, and reporting exceptions, for example, where you probably don't want to apply to say that nobody can access from this, that, or the other location. You might want to say there are some people that can get access regardless of where they are because they just need it to run this sales presentation or whatever it is, but you probably want those exceptions reporting. So evolving all the time. Let's move on now to integrating AD and Azure AD, which I think is really where I wanted to get to and what I want to talk about today. So let's a quick historical thing here. First of all, we were able to use something called DirSync, and that was a single forest solution which was based on an earlier version of MIM. MIM itself, when it used to be FIM, you could have a connector which connected to the cloud. Now, neither of these are supposed to be used anymore, but that gave a multi-forest solution. We then went through another version, which was Azure AD Sync. We've now arrived at Azure AD Connect. This is single and multi-forest. It has the best of all worlds taken from these. It is originally based on MIM, but it's changed a lot. And it does things like it configures ADFS for you. And there are other authentication methods that we'll talk about. It has a highly capable wizard installation, and it's the current and only one that should be used. So what's it trying to do? Well, first of all, let's be clear that it's actually a brand that incorporates a number of things. When I talk about Azure AD Connect, I'm primarily talking about Azure AD Connect Sync. So this is the synchronization tool which is going to synchronize objects from AD primarily towards Azure AD. But ADFS and even Ping Federate, another federation system, are considered part of it. And there's also a thin client that doesn't seem to have a proper name, but supports a number of different things like seamless single sign-on and password authentication, which we'll get onto. And then there's Azure AD Connect Health as well, which I will talk, but I probably won't talk about actually, which is a service that, as you would probably guess, monitors the health of Azure AD Connect and reports, surfaces reports and alerts in the cloud, sends alerts to your email and so on. I'm talking really primarily about Azure AD Connect Sync. So what's the idea? The idea is that AD objects are synchronized to Azure AD and continue to be mastered on premises. There are some write-back scenarios too, but fundamentally that's what's going on. Now, where multiple objects across multiple AD forests represent one person, which is a very common thing, and I'll come to that in a bit more detail later, we want to get one consolidated user in the cloud with the best combination of attributes. So that's partly what it's doing. And that one consolidated user will have all the group memberships in the cloud that they have on premises, well, to the extent that we want them to be there, that they can have all of the group memberships in the cloud they have on premises. Devices are also managed, but they're much simpler and barely worth talking about. Persons also get, I say persons rather than users, just to make the distinction between users in AD, get some kind of single sign-on. Same sign-on, single sign-on, we'll talk a little bit about that too. Much of this is out-of-the-box capability, but the important thing is you can also customize it. Now there is the simple case of one forest that can be implemented right out of the box as an express install. You barely have to do anything except next, finish. But let's talk a little bit about how it handles multi-forest scenarios. And this may be a little bit too detailed, but I've tried to simplify it. What goes on in Azure AD Connect is actually pretty complicated, but the outcome is pretty straightforward. If we've got active users in multiple forests, then they will result in in corresponding users in Azure AD. And if we have contacts, much the same thing will happen. But we're also very likely to have groups. And we want these groups also to be synchronized, and we want the memberships to come through. So far, so simple. It's all one-to-one and straightforward. But there are many other multi-forest scenarios. One of them would be where you have a contact in a forest which is linked to a user in another, or represents a user, I should say, in another. And that would be referred to often as the GAL-sync scenario, the global address list scenario. In that case, you need that linked contact joins up to its corresponding user, and you need that any group memberships that might be associated with it are also carried through. Another perhaps slightly less common scenario is where you have an inactive user in another forest that's associated with some kind of resource, exchange being the typical one. So we have an inactive user associated with an active user. That inactive user should not end up being represented in Azure AD, but it should somehow be linked up to its proper user, and any group membership it's got also carried through to the cloud. These are likely to be distribution lists, of course, as was the contact in the previous one. Also, yet another scenario is where you've got a forest trusting another forest, and you wish users from that other forest to be able to have access in this forest. So we might put them inside a group. Now, that user is not a real user. It's a foreign security principle automatically created as you drag the user into the group. And again, what we need there is that the user connects up to its corresponding user, and also that any groups are carried through with their memberships. So I'm just trying to show you that Azure AD Connect is highly capable. This is largely out-of-the-box stuff, not entirely, because it depends a little bit on the ability to identify the right objects, but largely out-of-the-box through a custom install. And it's pretty clever stuff. And what's even cleverer is that you can get in and modify the rules without having to completely reconfigure from the beginning. And that's something that we cover in our masterclass. Not shown here, but with some tweaks, common groups, if you have a suitable naming system, can also be consolidated, but I haven't shown that. As I say, you can have your own out-of-the-box, you can have your own rules that override the out-of-box rules, but you only do that with great care. So the bigger picture then is that we might have an on-premise estate, which includes Active Directory and a bunch of other applications, line of business apps, ERP system, and loads of HR-like systems, potentially HR, contractors, students and staff, these kind of things. We've got Azure AD Connect, synchronizing to the cloud, and what we have is a good ILM, Identity Lifecycle Management, then basis on-premise, and that's being used to drive what goes on in the cloud. All AD users are represented as consolidated users in Azure AD. All AD groups are represented with their membership as required. And note that the on-premises investment that's been made, for example, one of the most difficult bits is mediating between multiple HR systems, is paying off in the cloud. We're able to take the investment we've made and make sure that the cloud is benefiting from that. Single sign-on can be provided in a number of different ways. Some of them are federated options, which I won't go into because it's really quite separate from Azure AD Connect. But there are two Azure AD Connect managed ways of doing it. The default one is to have password hash sync, and that is a matter of taking the hash that's stored in AD and synchronizing it through to Azure AD. It's pretty simple, it's lightweight, and if we assume that the UPN is also synced, which you would expect, then you're getting same sign-on. AD password policies are respected on premises in this case, not the Azure AD ones, when changing or setting passwords, although it is interesting to note that when you actually log into the cloud, it's possible to do that without any reference to AD at all. So working hours policies wouldn't be respected and so on. Azure AD password protection is now applying on premises. And this is a big deal. So because the password hash is in the cloud, Azure's password protection is looking at those hashes and making sure that it's not in their list of compromised passwords, compromised credentials. And that is protecting your on-premises situation. And so you get the benefits through the security center for your on-premises situation. Azure conditional access is still available, so we can still use conditional access even with that. And we might also have password writeback going on, in which case passwords that are set in the cloud through self-service password reset, for example, are being used on premises, are being written back on premises, and if password hash sync is in place, that's still pushing that up into the cloud. The other managed authentication method with Azure AD Connect is pass-through authentication. And we're finding this to be very popular because not everybody wants to have password hashes in the cloud, but that's not the compelling reason, really. The compelling reason is that people often want to use all of their policies on premises to allow people to sign in or not, for example, working hours. And what's happening here is much more complicated than my diagram, but in very simple terms, when somebody signs into the cloud, they're redirected to an agent, a pass-through authentication agent, which will authenticate using Active Directory. That agent is using only outbound connections, so it's not opening up your corporate network at all. It's basically the agent is polling a queue which Azure AD loads up with requirements. You can still enable password hash sync, and that means that even though you're using password authentication, your on-premises credentials are still being protected by Cloud Identity Protection. And this is a great example of many that I've been talking about, where we're satisfying a user expectation, that is single sign-on, but we're staying secure. In fact, we're probably enhancing security. Something else I ought to mention is that where we've got this kind of on-premises involvement and single sign-on going on, this user might want to get access to on-premises applications and can do so through the cloud. So it's possible to use the Azure application proxy to get access to on-premises. Now, the great thing about that is that it's the cloud that's being used to sign in. Conditional access is still available. Identity protection is still there. And it's another great example of improving the user experience while actually enhancing security. Now, in all of these discussions, I've assumed that MIM is there. It's not necessary, of course. It's perfectly possible for Azure AD Connect to be synchronizing AD and Azure AD completely with anything else that we're talking here. And it may well be that you haven't got your HR on-premise anymore. You may have moved it to the cloud. And it's just worth mentioning that another trick up Azure AD Connect sleeve is that agent that I mentioned that hasn't really got a proper name, one of the other things it can do is pull the Workday data via the Azure AD provisioning service. That Azure AD provisioning service, by the way, its main job, its primary job, is to provision things like Salesforce, is to provision cloud apps. But it can also provision, through this agent, Active Directory. Again, there are no inbound connections required here. And in this way, we can use Workday, and one presumes eventually other cloud HR systems, along with our on-premises still Active Directory mastered users. It's perfectly possible to feed the Workday straight into Azure AD, but we're dealing here with the hybrid situation where your on-premises is still in charge, which is where most of us are. Let's now talk about the governance expectations. So if we've talked about on-premise, we've talked about cloud, and we've talked about connecting it together. And obviously, there's so much more that could be said. And we've recently released our Azure AD Connect masterclass, which is getting a lot of interest. So governance expectations. Overall, what we're looking for is cross-system governance. So we can have governance perhaps on premises, but we can definitely have governance in the cloud. Microsoft is making a great job of governance within Azure AD. But an overall governance solution has to deal with cross-system governance, cloud and on-premises, reaching out to all of the systems. We're definitely going to want delegated administration. If we're, for example, attesting, if we're in any way analyzing and attesting and deciding what access people should have for a particular application in a particular department or whatever, we want to push down those decisions to the level of a person that understands those systems. We want a modern UI, of course. And another very important thing about governance solutions is big bang systems are troublesome. They generally are difficult. The perfect enterprise role model is actually very hard to put together. And so it's hard to go out and say, right, we've done it all, there it is, we'll switch it on today. We need a way of getting into it without a big bang. I'll come to that. So the sorts of features we would expect, and probably don't need to read through all of these, but we need risk analytics, we need reporting and dashboards about the access people are getting and so on from various systems. We need to be able to manage access in various ways. Could be simple groups, could be attribute-based access control, role-based access control. We want users to be able to request access and for that to be granted in various ways. Segregation of duties is an important part of it, but that only makes sense if you can do it across systems. So we want to be able to say that somebody that has this access in this system shouldn't be able to have that access in that system. And very importantly, we want to somehow map our compliance controls to compliance frameworks. So we need to have the compliance frameworks that are out there available to test against. Privileged access obviously is a key area because that's that's where the crown jewels are kept. So we need to be able to monitor and manage privileged access expressly, and we want to be able to have risk-based workflows and approvals. In other words, rather than just saying to somebody, "Can you approve this?" we could say, "Can you approve this? And by the way, this looks high risk, medium risk, or low risk." Well, perhaps that's a little crude, but that sort of thing. Also, if we are to have a role model of some kind, we want a good way of mining roles. When I say bottom up and top down, if we were to look at Behold, we would see a rather clunky stepwise approach that says, well, we can see that the people in this department typically have these permissions, so maybe that's a role that you'd like. By bottom up, we're saying look at the data and look at the data in a big data AI fashion and say, what is it that's going on? What's the behavior here? And to suggest how we might define roles. So those are kind of things that we are expecting that we would like. And Saviynt indeed provides these. They describe themselves as GRC 2.0, I think. First of all, it does many of the things that Azure AD does, but it does it for all connected systems. So we're talking about role management, attestation of permissions, those kinds of things, which Azure AD does very well for itself, but doing it for all connected systems. And it also does many things that MIM does. For example, it can do object and attribute synchronization and password synchronization. We've already mentioned that it could fit right in where Behold lives, so it can do enterprise role management, segregation of duties, and so on. But it takes a risk-based approach. So, as an example, rather than preventing an SOD violation, which is where Behold would have taken us, it will allow you to assign a risk level and monitor violations and monitor your progress towards regulatory compliance. And since the compliance framework's built in, that's readily possible. It's cloud architected and it's a user-facing system. It has a modern UI. So in summary, we're talking about intelligent, risk-based, user-friendly governance for exactly the kind of hybrid situations that we've just been discussing. So in terms of an approach and the sort of architectures that we're dealing with, the traditional approach, as I've said, can be very challenging of define your model and apply it. So another approach is to do governance first. So pull in all the users and all the entitlement information and then compare actual intended states. And you can do this in relation to known compliance frameworks. So we're pulling information out of all these systems, analyzing and reporting, as I say, with reference to compliance frameworks. So we can assign risk levels to violations, we can produce risk scores, and that helps us monitor our progress. Remediation in this model isn't automated. We can do it somewhere else. We can do it manually. We can do it by whatever systems we've got. And by the way, nothing here is relying on a synchronization solution at all. It's simply saying go and pull the data. But of course, we would recommend that there should be a formal identity lifecycle management system of which synchronization is a key feature. Why? Because good governance depends on reliable identity data, and there's every possibility that if you haven't got that in place, you're looking at data and misinterpreting it. So have the ILM in place, but by all means, do governance first in the sense of let's measure before we attempt to automate the response. But having done that, you're then in a position to start to develop your model. The diagram here may look the same as the last one, but there are arrows back towards the systems that are being analyzed, because you've now got the data you need to build a model to manage entitlements, and you've also got the plumbing you need to write it back. So now you're in a position to develop your model using the tools that are available to help you do it from Saviynt. And the other thing I would just mention, and this is the final architecture slide that I'm showing here, is where GRC is required and MIM's not already present, the answer could be to use Saviynt alone, because it does pretty good ILM. I would say not as good as MIM, but it does a pretty good job. And of course, it does GRC, it does governance, risk, and compliance, does that job very well and is cloud friendly. If MIM is in place, then there's no benefit in replacing it, and it plays nicely with MIM plays nicely with Saviynt anyway. These are very broad brush statements, so you'd have to look at specific requirements and details, including cost, of course, and that may change the picture. Just making the point that there are options here to think about. Now, I feel that this has come to something of a crashing end, and I couldn't think of a really good way to finish this, but so I'm just going to say it how it is. We think that if you've got a solid ILM foundation, then AD can be readily integrated with Azure AD to huge benefit in both directions. So you're driving your locally managed identity is driving what's going on in the cloud, so it's driving your directory in the cloud, but you're getting benefits coming back from the identity protection that's going on in the cloud, in Azure AD. It's also possible to meet growing user expectations while security is maintained or even enhanced. And then the other thing that I brought into this is Saviynt provides complementary hybrid governance capabilities that go across cloud and on-premises and reach out to any of these systems just about. So it is possible to increase rate of change and stay in control. So that's pretty much all I've got to say for today. So if you want to know more about AD Connect, we do offer their masterclass. There's the link. For everything else, you can contact us directly. Now, just before you go, I'd be very grateful if you could answer a few very simple questions. So I'm just putting up just 4 quick questions, which would be grateful if you would answer before you go. And I'm getting lots of responses, lots of interest in the Azure, in the first masterclass. Thank you very much. Second one coming up is about the Azure AD Connect masterclass, and you'll notice that we're putting this on in a number of different formats. Yeah, very interested to see a lot of interest in online on demand. That is going to be available within about a week. So we're going to be publishing that very soon as an on-demand class. Thank you for that. Penultimate question is about whether you're interested in discussing your particular integration needs. It's a nice, easy one for you to answer. And I'm getting lots of maybes there, and a lot of yeses, actually. And then the last of my polls is, are you interested in hearing more about Saviynt? And Savient's a complex product. Oh, a lot of interest in Saviynt. That is interesting. Okay, well, maybe the next thing I should do is something about Saviynt and demoing it, but in the meantime, we can reach out to you. A huge amount of interest in that. Okay, well, thanks very much for that. And I've got a couple of questions, which I'm going to deal with now. This one says, we've already installed Azure AD Connect. Is there any point in going on the masterclass? Actually, we've had a number of people come on the course who've already installed Azure AD Connect. And I remember one very memorable one where a guy came along, looked at the thickness of the manual and said, really? It all seems so simple. What can we possibly talk about for the next 3 days? And at the end of the 3 days, he said, okay, I get it now. Because we talk about how you can safely adjust the rules to your benefit. We talk about all the different ways of authenticating. We talk about all the operational issues, about high availability. We had people who didn't realize that their software wasn't updating properly. We cover the whole gamut of everything, from all the different options for installation and all the operational factors, what's supported, what's not supported, and so on. Now, I think we're right up to the end of the 45 minutes, so there are a few more questions here, which I will answer out of band after the course, after the webinar, sorry. So for the moment, I'm going to say thanks very much for your time, and watch out for more webinars from us. So thanks very much. Have a great evening, afternoon, morning, whatever it is for you. And goodbye.